Hello, everyone. I am Georgia Calvin-Smith, and it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this new episode of the Africa CEO Forum's Fair Climate Transition webinar series, where we'll be unpicking options as Africa pushes to claim as much space as it can at the global climate decision-making table. Now, at last year's COP29 in Dubai, Africa made enormous progress in terms of representation. Its governments aligned their visions and voices at the Africa Climate Summit beforehand and left an impression. Now, the African private sector was there too, with Africa CEO Forum member Africa 50 being selected to disburse billions in potential climate investments promised by the UAE. Now, 1 year on, impressions have faded, but the stakes are too high for the continent for it to let up its push for progress, and progress of its own imagining. COP29 has been dubbed the finance COP, the less sexy, but arguably more important little brother to last year's focus on big announcements. Well, next month in Azerbaijan, decisions will be made not on how much, but on the details of who pays, by when, and what the conditions are. For Africa, there is a lot at stake, from avoiding a future climate finance debt burden to raising capital to build a truly competitive and future-proof Africa. So, to discuss all of what's at stake for Africa at COP29 and how to get the continent what it needs, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel, joining me from all around the world, and all of whom are working to promote and often, as one has to, defend Africa's interests on the global stage. So, from one of Africa's largest Pan-African banks, Rachel Antwi, the head of Group Sustainability at EcoBank Group. Rachel, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us. Also joining us from Johannesburg, we've got Dio Onyango, Sustainable Finance Specialist at the IFC, and representing one of the continent's most engaged philanthropic organizations, Natalie Delapalme, Executive Director and Board Member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Now, viewers, we need to hear from you too. Your insights, questions, observations are all at the heart of what makes conversations like this one relevant and more than just chit-chat. So do tell us what you think. Throughout the discussion, you can ask our panelists questions by posting them in the Q&A tab of your Zoom app. And if you do, please remember to let us know to whom you'd like the question to be addressed, and I'll redirect it when I can accordingly. But let's crack on. So we're going to start off by looking at the lay of the land regarding the obstacles to unlocking and dispersing climate finance for Africa. Dio, I'm going to come to you first. What's your take on this, and how do you think it all feeds into the stakes for governments, societies, and business when it comes to what's likely to come out of COP29?
Thank you very much, Georgia, and thank you to the Africa CEO Forum for inviting me to this webinar, and to all the audiences, welcome, and looking forward to your questions. I think starting off, the Africa Development Bank has done a study and says that Africa loses between 5 to 15% of GDP per annum to climate change and requires well over 2.8 trillion over the 10 years, 2020 to 2030. In order to implement all the national determined contributions that all the 54 countries in Africa have submitted under the Paris Agreement. However, to date, the continent's annual climate finance flows stand at only 30 billion. This, without a doubt, leaves a climate financing gap of over 200 billion annually. And so what this means, if we look at that 30 billion, most of that is public financing and some private financing that's supporting action around climate impacts for the continent. But this leaves quite a staggering sort of financing gap for the continent. At that same time, the cost of transitioning all our economies into climate resilient economies continues to increase and are substantially and quite staggering. So the main focus for us is really how do we increasingly and urgently augment the public financing that today is short of meeting the goals that are required to address climate challenges with private capital. At the same time, when we look across Africa, is how can we support domestic climate finance strategies to actually take some best practices and also incorporate some international financing mechanism to enhance and encourage more investment on climate finance initiatives. And lastly, more than just mitigation, which is a transition from, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. For the continent, which is the least contributor for greenhouse gas emissions, a bigger focus on adaptation is necessary in order to make our economies more resilient in the longer term to the impacts of climate change.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean in terms of tangibles? What things that can move forward on all the points that you've just raised now are likely or possible to come out of COP, best case scenario?
Yes, I think the likely scenario for Africa at COP is a couple of things. One of the key discussions coming out of last year was around Article 6. Article 6 provides a substantial opportunity for Africa to actually harness the carbon markets and discussions of how countries can actually work together, especially recognizing that there's a lot of potential in voluntary markets to actually bring together solutions that may support small, medium-sized enterprises that today are not participating in addressing climate change. And this could actually create opportunities for a lot of the SMEs in Africa to really have non-debt related results-based financing. And what I mean by that is where no collateral is required, but really the focus is on the tangible results that these SMEs may actually participate in. So Article 6 and being able to support how countries across Africa would be able to operationalize carbon markets, help SMEs to be able to get non-debt and result-based financing that doesn't require assets or collateral. This could potentially enable enterprises in the regions that do struggle to have access on other sources of climate finance to grow. So I think, one of the key opportunities at this COP is a resolution around Article 6 and how that would then work in the carbon accounting to support, the countries across Africa as one effort. A second there's quite a strong initiative that's been going on the interoperability of taxonomies. This allows for classification of climate-related initiatives and being able to support this, especially when you think about the continent with 54 countries, having a taxonomy for classification of those initiatives that actually works also in line with the investors when you think about Europe and the European taxonomy that may have a little bit of an additional burden for initiatives on the continent. So working out how that would support more initiatives and accounting for the classification of climate-related initiatives would be really a big win for Africa.
Thanks so much for that. You've been pretty thorough. Natalie, I'm going to come to you now. What's your take on this? Is there anything else that you think is a key consideration to talks about balancing African economic development, global climate goals? When you talk about fair climate transition, it's huge. It's everything from policy to governance. So what for you are the really central issues that need to be looked at?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me indeed. I think that when we are talking about a fair climate transition, we are talking about a transition that's equitable and sustainable for all, already developed and developing countries alike. Now, when we talk about energy transition, it's not the same reading for developed countries who already have access to energy for all their population, or for developing countries. In Africa, you still have 600 million people who don't have access to energy. 600 million people, it's twice the US population, and it's 1.4 Europe's population. No access to energy means no health, no education, no business, no jobs, no prospects. So I think we are all aware now that whether it comes to the UN Sustainable Goals or to the African Union Agenda 2063, we are totally off track. So we need to understand that from the African viewpoint, the current climate conversation debate is still very much led by already developed countries, for which energy transition doesn't have the same meaning as they have for their people. And it's difficult to sell the point that you need to save the planet to the expense of its people. So it means that we need to reconcile climate and development, both climate and development policies, agendas, and finance. And it's true that one of the concerns that can be had at African level is the fact that the current debate and the current solutions that have been found or tried to find when it comes to financing climate is having a crowding effect on the financing of development. So really, once again, this reconciling African development and climate is key. Now, 2 points here. The first one is not to reduce Africa only to its vulnerability, and have a conversation which is how can developed countries help poor Africa to sort out its specific challenges, especially when Africa is not responsible, as we all know, for the current carbon emission level or current carbon stock in that year. It's absolutely key to see Africa as a key player, potential player, when it comes to building a green global economy. Without Africa's potential, without Africa's assets, without Africa's critical minerals, carbon sinking potential, biodiversity wealth, there will be no green global economy. So once again, focusing also on when it comes to climate finance, on the way climate finance can contribute, I prefer contribute rather than help, contribute to unlock and leverage Africa's potential to green industrialization, of course, when it comes to Africa, but also to make the best use of Africa's green assets. And maybe a last point here is, because indeed this climate debate has been until now mainly led by developed countries, who are also the biggest carbon emitters, it has been focusing on mitigation rather than adaptation. Whereas in Africa, the big challenge is adaptation. So we also need to move that needle a little bit.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So, one of the points you were making is Africa shouldn't be reduced to its vulnerabilities, and you really have to be looking at the big picture, particularly in response with regard to its economic potential. But that can't be achieved without money. Rachel, I'm going to come to you. So from your experience working with private sector clients, what do you find to currently be the main barriers to attracting more private investment to really ramp up climate projects in Africa and its economic development in general, really?
Thank you very much, Georgia. Yes, as Dio has mentioned, there is quite a lot of interest in finance and climate finance projects in Africa. But however, there are some barriers, some key barriers that are preventing this. And I'll give you some top 5 examples. For example, the top biggest one is lack of access to affordable financing. For example, for a bank like EcoBank, we've managed to raise about $500 million in the last 2 to 3 years to finance through bilateral and capital market projects, and sometimes even club deals, to finance climate finance or sustainable finance projects. What we find is that the loan is always very expensive, and so very difficult for us to on-lend to our customers to be able to finance enough climate finance transactions. normally we have to ring fence certain clients who receive sort of some form of dollar revenue to be able to finance them. And that's quite a limited number. And that also kind of deters our customers, because when we price it and on lend, it's also very expensive to lend to them, whether in local currency or even in foreign currency. So access to affordable financing is one of the key deterrents or barriers that we see in the market. Secondly, as well, is lack of knowledge and capacity building. There is not much knowledge in the market on climate finance transactions to be able to develop more innovative products, and that we found us to be quite a big challenge in the market. For EcoBank as a bank, what we've tried to do is we educate our customers through various channels, conferences, and webinars on the various products and things that we have developed. We work with governments and other institutions to be able to also do this. But another key problem that we also find is infrastructure gaps, right? Lack of proper infrastructure systems, illiquid markets to be able to trade some of these instruments, which continues to remain sort of a barrier compared to Europe and the rest of the developed markets for us in Africa. Another point that is also very important that I find is a lack of bankable projects, and I think you've seen that quite a lot. So even if there is an interest and there's a small pool of money that we can use, we do not have enough ready-made projects that are scalable, that has investor interest, or is attractive enough for investors to be able to invest in. So if you look at these.
Sorry,
yes.
So before we move on, Jimmy, do you have some examples of what has worked, some de-risking instruments that have delivered on bringing in more private capital, and anything likely to come out of COP29 that you think might lead to more of the same? Very quickly.
Well, so what I'm looking at for COP23, we're looking at more maybe guarantee instruments, insurance and guarantee instruments. So, for example, EcoBank, we partnered with the Africa Guarantee Fund to sort of guarantee some of the sustainable finance of the climate finance transactions. We're looking at more of such instruments out of COP coming through. We're looking at also more of expansion of the Green Climate Fund platform to be able to do more transactions and through that, along with other collaborations with DFIs and multinationals and all of that. So those are some of the things that we're looking at through the COP conference.
Thank you so much, Dio, Rachel, Natalie, for helping us get started by looking at some of those obstacles to unlocking and disbursing climate finance for Africa. Audience, stay with us. Short break, and we'll be back in a couple of moments for a look at how Africa can advance balancing prosperity with green growth. So, as promised, we're now going to be pivoting for a look at how Africa can advance its joint interests of prosperity and green growth. Dio, coming back to you, do you think that at this stage there truly is regional alignment that green growth is a priority for Africa at this stage?
Yes, I think, a tremendous initiative last year was when the Kenyan president set up the Africa Climate Finance Forum, which was really the first time that heads of state gathered together in order to have one voice ahead of going into COP, and also to coalesce around, what were the priorities for the continent. So one of those priorities that came out of those discussions was, as an example, the necessity to actually move ahead in really setting up a framework that would catalyze carbon credits and the carbon markets. And so this has brought that on the table, has elevated its importance, has really injected a lot of effort on the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, with a clear recognition, as Natalie said, Africa's rich biodiversity and can really be a tremendous contributor to the green growth globally, right? And so I think what I see is that Africa is really making an effort towards having a voice, and that's a joint voice in what are the priorities for the continent. And I do believe if more of this action and that type of action is necessary to really strengthen Africa's position, and on the table as well, to be able to push for agreement, as well as not just an agreement, but actual real action that tangibly helps Africa to be a direct contributor to the global green growth.
Mm-hmm. So, Rachel, I'm going to come to you. What do you think, who should be pushing this? What do you think are the most important and relevant financial institutions in leading the continent's growth, green or otherwise?
Oh, there are quite a number, to be honest. In Africa, I would say we have EcoBank, who I've told you that we're doing quite a lot on the continent. We have a number of banks in South Africa as well. We have a number of banks in East Africa. You have Standard Bank, you have EcoBank, you have Nedbank, you have Access Bank. So there are a number of financial institutions that are already doing quite a lot within this particular space and continue to push beyond the boundaries to support governments and customers in driving the climate transition and climate finance.
And what do you think the role is of the African private sector in financing the continent's transition? What can African businesses do more of to make sure that it's both fair and functional?
Thank you very much. So there are a lot of public-private partnerships that are required. We see now there isn't much enough strong collaboration between the DFIs, the multilaterals, and the private sector to sort of de-risk some of the investments that we see and also increase capacity building, etc. So what we need is more stronger collaborations between the private sector and the DFIs and also even the governments to be able to sort of create a good, a more liquid market to promote climate finance transactions on the continent and to de-risk it. And I think this is one of the key things that we need to do to be able to sort of grow the market.
So you mentioned there the role of governments. Natalie, you're in a great position to examine this just a little bit more in detail. What's your take on what they could do to help harmonize green industrial policies and push forward the creation of integrated regional value chains?
Thank you very much. First, once again, I think one of the key things that has already been achieved by African governments is coming together under the chairmanship of Kenya, President Ruto, with this first African Climate Summit, which was held in Nairobi 2 years ago now. I really think that the final declaration is indeed putting together probably all that comes to an African common position. Now, on the practical side, I would say that the priority is probably indeed what we call regional integration. That is, in fact, the continental integration. If indeed the African common market comes to full implementation, it will be the biggest market at world level. And regional market is built on economic interest. It's linked to economic insight. Look at European Union. European Union is thriving today, and the political union came after the building of a common position around coal and steel. It was the CECA, the Communauté économique acier et charbon, who founded European Union first. So putting your interests together, once again, if China was 54 countries, it wouldn't be China. So it's really important to build that common position. And when you are talking, for example, about private sector, it's probably very important also that the African private sector finds a way to elaborate a common position on what exactly they need or what is lacking for them indeed to commit or to enter in a more efficient way this green industrialization, etc. One of the points being and I think it has always been mentioned by my colleagues, the question of African risk. We need to work about African risk, both on the assessment of the African risk, which for the time being is being mainly done by the big three rating agencies. And there is probably a premium, a specific African premium that needs to be addressed, and two, on covering that risk. Because, I mean, private sector is not a philanthropy. I mean, they need to find their interest in investing. They need to take the risk, but they need also to have some way of covering that, or to finding interesting enough, if I may say so, to take it. So I think it's something we need to work on. But once again, regional integration is absolutely key.
And Dio, you know, as much as regional integration is key for kind of scaling up the continent's voice, the continent's heft, the way things are at the moment, each country, you know, they've got their own core needs. Issues like health and security, you know, they'll probably top the external push for kind of pivoting towards more kind of green industries. So what do you think could happen, needs to happen, to make climate action better aligned with the current needs and of African nations?
Thank you. And that's probably the key challenge for even the public sector in Africa, which is balancing the needs, in as much as we're all focusing on shared prosperity, is balancing the climate challenges and the vulnerability of the continent with the immediate needs of the population, which and the food security as a key, health, transportation, and just supporting that. So for the continent and for most of our governments, a key issue is to then really kind of balance out what are if you take as an example, the core needs around health and security, a recognition that on an employment level, agriculture is a core sector for the continent, employs more than 65% of the continent's population, provides food security. But however, agriculture is 95% rain-fed. And so the challenges that we're having with unpredictable weather pattern is really creating a huge challenge for the governments with regards to managing food security and also being able to ensure the sustenance of their populace is managed. And so being able to bring together those twin challenges, which is what are the immediate and critical challenges that we have on the public sector side, and realizing that impacts of climate are actually directly bringing insecurity in those areas. And then how do we work on them? As Natalie pointed out earlier as well, it's important from an African perspective to really focus on adaptation and resilience. And this needs to be at the core of all discussions for Africa with regards to climate financing, but also in order to put together a framework that would allow for us to support all of the financing. As Rachel pointed out, all the banks in Africa today, and also on the policy side, there's been a tremendous push to start focusing on climate risk and exposures for banks, as well as encouraging banks to really build up their portfolio allocations to climate finance. So we're seeing more and more of financial flows across the banks as well, looking at various aspects of initiatives. However, the challenge that we see is the gap, particularly on where the continent is really facing a climate financing gap and where the continent needs support on adaptation and resilience. So as mentioned, as a sector like agriculture, which employs most of our population, provides up to 65% of employment, but at the same time, provides food security for the continent. But at the same time, is probably the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. How we can have more targeted financing and supporting financial institutions to apportion funding to this sector is critical. It's very, very critical, right?
Thanks, Dio. So targeted financing, it's come up again and again from our panelists. I'm going to take a quick moment now to take a question from one of the viewers joining us currently, which kind of picks up on that. Angela Sales, she's asking, what is the point in obtaining financial instruments that are still unfairly expensive? And does the same financial access cost the same in Europe and South America? Rachel, I'm going to let you take this one, since you earlier raised just how problematic the lack of instruments tailored to the African context and African priorities is proving to be. What would you say to Angela's question?
Thank you very much. I wouldn't say that it is not worth it. I think it's still definitely worth it to access the markets. There is still a lot that can be done. As I mentioned, they're very expensive. So one of the things that we can do is partner more African private sector with governments and DFIs and multilaterals to sort of try and drive the prices down in view of what we want to be able to achieve. Because other than that, then there'll be no purpose in doing it. And most people would just move away from climate finance transactions and probably just do various vanilla transactions. So it is very expensive. There's still a need to do it, but there's still work to be done by collaborating with governments and positioning Africa well. To be able to push for more reduced pricing and more attractive investments. We could also look at more innovative financing, or even financing ourselves within the African market at a much cheaper rate than going on international markets. But certainly this is a big challenge. Our pricing for climate finance transactions are much more expensive compared to the developed markets. But hopefully we are working on a number of solutions with governments and DFIs and the rest of them to be able to sort of work around this obstacle that we face that is very difficult for us.
Thank you so much for breaking that down, Rachel. We have time for one more question before we move on to our next segment. This one from Natalie Cifuentes Riano. She's asking, what are the key risks and challenges that the African private sector needs to address in order to find a common position on green industrialization? I will, Dio, Natalie, do either of you have do you want to jump in on this one? Otherwise, I will pluck you from the ether and let you tackle it. Okay.
I think that...
Please, Dio, continue.
Yes, I think that one of the key issues is risk. For private capital to be mobilized to address some of the issues on the continent, de-risking and approaching, looking at blended concessional financing that, for example, would take some of the cost out of the funding, and that would help to stimulate some of the flow of private capital into emerging markets is quite critical. GFIs such as IFC are providing this donor concessional financing that are able to rebalance that risk-reward equation. And I think for private sector, that's probably the first most critical element is how do you make some of these projects commercially viable? How do you crowd in private capital? And then, so importantly, blending the finance that helps to bring down that cost as early as possible in the project gestation period, helps to crowd in more capital. As you will see with some of the issuances that EcoBank has had, or Standard Bank, First Round across the continent, you will see that there's always an element of a blended concessional financing. And I'll take the example of, where the developed world, the UK government, together with IFC, put together the Market Accelerator for Green Construction, which is a blended concessional financing aiming to catalyze more green construction building units across the continent, with the recognition that there's a massive housing deficit. And how do we make sure that the houses that are being put up are more resilient for the future, have a low, provide for energy as well as for water security. And so the concessional financing is very targeted towards developers and incentivizing them to put elements from an energy perspective, like solar panels, to use recycled materials as part of the materials being used, and also to look at water solutions, water storage solutions for this unit. And across the continent today, you'll find in South Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, and Morocco, and Senegal, we're now putting together programs that is catalyzing more green real estate development through a performance-based incentive that is funded by the UK government. So the concessional financing is a critical way of de-risking and rebalancing that risk reward equation.
Thank you so much, Dio. Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you very much, Rachel, for all your insight into how Africa can pursue those parallel paths of prosperity and green growth. Take a quick break now before we move on for a look at how hard should Africa be playing during the climate finance negotiations. So, can Africa play hardball during climate finance negotiations? Natalie, I'm going to start with you. Do you think the question of Africa's assertiveness at these international climate finance talks is relevant at this stage?
Yes, I think it's very important indeed to make sure that their voice is heard. We talked about the importance of having an African common position, which is key and something that we fight for and work for at the IBM Foundation. The reason we say that is once you have a voice, once you are allowed at the table of negotiation, at the board table, which has not been enough the case until now, being at the board table means that you are part of the decision-making process. When you are part of the decision-making process, you own the decision and you're accountable for its implementation. So once again, it's very important, and I think a huge step has been made by having the African Union, by having Africa, or African Union as Africa, becoming a full-fledged member of the G20.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the G20 is going to be next hosted by South Africa is certainly something that's very important, and which definitely allow Africa to make its voice heard. Ahead of that, and ahead of COP29, it's once again important for African leaders, African private sector, I would say African stakeholders, to come up with a common position during the negotiation and to once again make the point that we need to reconcile climate and development, that there is a way to reconcile, and that we need to leverage Africa's potential when it comes to climate, addressing the climate challenge. Not only about addressing Africa's vulnerability, it's also about leveraging Africa's assets.
Thanks so much, Natalie. So, Dio, Natalie's saying that it's not a case of how hard the Africa is negotiating. First of all, it's about a need for more of an African presence. But with things being as they are, some argue that Africa's historical lack of contribution to emissions gives it moral authority to play hardball in chasing more unconditional climate finance from rich nations. Do you think that this is a position that African negotiators should or can leverage more? And is there a risk to that?
I think the first focus is where does Africa have leverage? And I think the biggest leverage Africa has is contributing to this global green economy definition is really in the carbon sink potential that the continent has. This obviously elevates, the pricing of carbon credits and how Africa can contribute to offset some of the global emissions that have happened. I think recognizing that there's tremendous leverage on the continent's, resources and capability of being able to be a major carbon sink for the world as a whole is where the leverage comes. And once our negotiators together recognize where this leverage is, they can then use it to drive, first and foremost, the framework that is necessary to strengthen this leverage and to then help to price carbon credits. And then that obviously has a direct effect in channeling the financing back onto the continent that enables channeling that non-debt results-based financing back onto the continent that then would catalyze and support the growth of SMEs, the growth of the economies directly. So it's recognizing where the leverage is an important negotiating element. And so putting emphasis on where that is will really support the African negotiators. Outside of that, I think it is a little bit of a challenge because for the continent, there's still quite a major financing gap. And I think Natalie laid out really the balancing of the equations as to which economies are still leading the discussion, and being able to kind of rebalance that will take tremendous effort.
Mm-hmm. And in that rebalancing, Rachel, when we spoke earlier, you were saying that you think that Africa really needs to head into international events like COP with a winner's mentality to get what they need. What does that look like to you?
Thank you very much, Natalie. Exactly that. A winner's mentality for me means tackling this from a solutions-orientated perspective. There is a lot Africa has to offer. Africa mustn't always be seen as looking for aid because we didn't contribute to climate change. We're just looking for money. It always paints us in a very negative light. In this climate transition that is going on, there are a lot of opportunities. There's winners and losers that are going to come up. There are new sectors that are being developed. For example, what Africa can do is position ourselves as a sustainable development hub for certain infrastructure projects. So, for example, we could be manufacturing a lot of renewable energy projects through regulations with governments and partnerships. We have a lot of natural resources as well, hydrogen, for example, a lot in Namibia, and other natural resources for e-mobility, etc., that we can leverage off to make us more attractive to investors. Another example as well is we could also collaborate more with a unified voice to be able to push for better regulations or better transformation of the financial architecture. As we've mentioned, access to finance is very expensive. So we can look at sort of pushing with a unified voice to reduce the cost of financing on the continent. There is a lot that Africa can do, and there's a lot that we have available to us to be able to achieve. We just need to leverage on it, be more solutions orientated, present our case with more facts and more solutions, and with data, and then invite other people to partner with us and for us to be able to develop more sustainably. In that way, I think there are many more wins that we can gain than just going there and sort of seeking for some kind of handouts and stuff that are very difficult to get at this moment. Don't get me wrong, we still do need some aid, etc. But I think we can be in a stronger position if we come up to the table with a more solutions-orientated approach to climate change, that we want to win in the new climate transition. We want to put ourselves in a better position.
Where does the private sector sit in this we?
Thank you. So for the private sector, we could also be financing some innovative projects. So for example, we could be financing carbon capture projects. I've seen quite a lot happening on the global markets, etc. Africa is in a very unique position to be able to finance some of this. And we need to be able to see more private sector investments within this particular arena, including renewable energy projects, green infrastructure projects, etc. The few barriers that we mentioned earlier that are hindering some of these things that we need to be able to also work collaboratively, the private sector with governments and everything, to be able to sort of unlock this investment market for us to be able to do more or make it more liquid and attractive for us.
And Natalie, Rachel's there outlining how important it is that Africa's presence is very kind of solutions focused, but is the solution always money? Is it always financing? Beyond monetary pledges, what's your take on what Africa could be hoping to get out of COP that could also have a real impact on the continent's economic growth?
I mean, we recently at the foundation a couple of months ago produced a report that and organized a debate around financing Africa, where is the money? And among the key points and the key conclusions and recommendations, I would cite two. The first is, of course, the needs are staggering. Once again, we are totally off track when it comes to SDGs, and climate needs, as we all know, are numbered by trillions. But what we found is when it comes to the external resources, more than we think, the money is there. So what we need is not necessarily additional pledges, additional financial pledges, if only because they are very seldom implemented. And this feeds the growing mistrust into all these big gatherings and, these huge pledges. But we certainly need better processes and better tools, or more efficient tools, adapted indeed to the needs. We've talked about the risk coverage. We can talk about delays. It takes too much time to implement decisions made. When you think, for example, that we are now 2 years after the decision that had been taken to issue 650 billion additional SDRs post-COVID to allow countries to deal with the COVID impact. And we are still running behind mechanisms that would allow the most needing countries to benefit from that. This is not acceptable. And if indeed we are beginning to think about could we do the same and have an additional SDRs allocation for climate, if it takes another 2 or 3 years to make sure that it goes to the countries or the sectors that need it the most, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So we definitely need to work on the processes. World Bank is really strongly committed to do that. I hope that the discussion that's currently leading to the replenishment of IDA to be taken in December will not only consider the replenishment of the funds, but also the amendment of the processes. So once again, I wouldn't say we don't need more money, but we need better money, but we certainly need as much better money as more money. Mm-hmm. But the third point is there are indeed African domestic resources that can be leveraged. Pension funds, sovereign funds, specific taxes, putting an end to illicit financial flows. I mean, illicit financial flows is $100 billion leaving the continent every year. This could certainly very well fund quite a lot of climate projects. Mm-hmm. And as we keep saying, as we have all said, monetizing Africa's green assets. Africa critical minerals, Africa carbon sinking potential, forest and ocean alike. I mean, Africa is home to 1/3 of the critical mineral global reserves.
Natalie? Thank you. No, nothing to put. Thank you so much for for breaking that down for us. Unfortunately, time, as always, is against us, and I really do want to make sure we can squeeze in some questions from the audience. We've got one that has been directed towards Dio, asking, differences in development and energy access across Africa go a long way in shaping individual nations' positions in negotiations like COP. So can we really talk about there being a unified African position when it comes to approaching climate change development and green transition? Dio, quickly, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, just to clarify, the question is with regards to energy access across the continent?
The question is about how in a continent where there's such vastly different economic positions, how does that affect the point made by all of the panelists that it's really important that the continent approach talks like COP29 with a unified outlook and intention?
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I think if you look at the energy needs across the continent, of course, the more developed economies across the continent, like South Africa, will have a much larger sort of energy transition need. South Africa today has most of its power from coal, but has put in a program that is enabling that transition. However, a country like Guinea, for example, will have very different needs. The important thing is to balance it based on what is the immediate need today that supports continuous growth of that economy, and to what extent on the ground are you enabling some of the initiatives that have been put, the small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as just pure subsistence needs. How do you enable them to participate in the same way that, for example, communication through a mobile phone has enabled information access globally, right? So it is looking at how do we balance within the locality in itself and what the needs are, and to what extent is the government in that locality actually being able to provide or channel the resources towards addressing the needs of its populace. And in that particular case, you'll find that the national determined contributions actually do give a very good guideline, and the amounts that each country requires are not exactly the same. They're very locally based. The initiatives that we see that some of the governments have put together on plans, on paper, but need support in order to activate, actually reflect the needs on the ground. And it is the question for us today is, to what extent do we go back to those national determined contributions and goals that were set? To what extent do we support the public sector to actually emphasize and start focusing on that with the funding that's there, that they are able to mobilize, as well as what they are receiving? And then to what extent do we then ensure that each one of those economies are as well participating in the effort towards making sure that we have Africa in totality being a full-fledged participant in the global world's green growth? And I think there's the national determined contributions actually would be able to give us a clear guide on how to then work on the basis on the needs of each country. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is also the fact that there's a recognition that Africa does have energy resources that would actually contribute to more greenhouse gas emissions. So gas, as an example, there is in the Gulf of Guinea, has around 40 CF of gas reserves. And the big question there is, how do you monetize that to be part of a transition fuel that then also enables that locality to be able to mobilize some funds that then has a key contribution to its total economy as well. So I think the solution is not one, but is one where each locality will require a tailor-made solution. However, from a voice point of view, being able to coalesce the effort. There is a tremendous need to ensure that Africa is speaking as one and as a very strong voice, given its vulnerability and given its very low contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions, which are a primary contributor to climate impacts today.
Thank you so much, dear. Now, Rachel, I'm going to come back to you. Considering the taxonomies of financing criteria set out by international bodies like the ICMA can be very Eurocentric and not consider the African context, when it comes to obstacles to climate change financing, let's be very specific. How would you rate new Pan-African institutions, for example, the Africa Energy Bank's role in shaping negotiations to come?
Thank you very much. So I think Pan-African financial institutions, for example, can push for taxonomies that are more conducive to the African market, something that is contextualized for us, and which is not so Eurocentric, because then what happens is that when we raise climate finance transactions and want to finance certain transactions, then you'd find that, there's a lot of greenwashing, or we just can't use the money because what they may define as, a developmental impact project or something based on the taxonomy may not be applicable. For example, even what may be rural to them may be very difficult for us to sort of finance that transaction just on the basis of the bankability of it. So in going into COP, we need to be very mindful of this, come with a unified voice to come and redefine the financial markets again, some of these taxonomies, redefine how we're going to play in the market, also looking at financial instruments that can be used, etc. So that is one thing that we can look at going into COP to work with the, our partners, global partners in the financial markets, etc. I know, for example, other countries are coming up with their own taxonomies as well, but too many taxonomies on the continent sort of makes it very difficult to apply, because then, for example, EcoBank with 33 countries, and imagine if I have the money that I have to on-lend across 33 countries and I have to work through 33 taxonomies. That is crazy. So, we need to look at one institutional body that will manage this, and we have a standardized taxonomy that can be applied. It removes all the unnecessary administrative and regulatory burdens that we are seeing currently that is coming up. And if we can achieve that, that would be very good for us.
That's such a hopeful way of ending what is unfortunately going to be your last contribution to this conversation. But before we move on, to wrap it all up, Natalie, I just want to give you a quick last word. You have so much experience at this level. What I do want to ask you is, what would your advice be to negotiators heading into COP, trying to defend the continent's interests on global issues? 20 seconds.
20 seconds.
I know, it's a hard word.
Common position indeed, but not in a begging position. I think we need to switch from what can you do to help us, to what can we do to help you. I think it's a partnership rather than an aid conversation. I think it's very important.
Thank you so much. Natalie, Deo, Rachel, we have so many more questions from Ogi Ngoy, Timothy Balakutu, Kajun Laklifi, and many more. But unfortunately, as it always is, we are out of time. So, thank you for our panelists for all of their contributions. We've talked a lot about aligning the positions of those who want the best for Africa, both economically and socially, and that cannot happen without check-ins like these. So thank you all for being here with me today. We're glad to have you in our corner as we head into COP29. And also, thank you to our viewers. The work doesn't stop here, of course, so let us know what you think when it comes to shaping Africa's future, what should come next, either for Africa CEO or beyond. Don't hesitate to reach out with your ideas. But for now, it was a pleasure being here with you, and goodbye from all of us here in Paris.
Goodbye.